sponsored by the College of Architecture, Planning and Landscape Architecture, as well as the College of Engineering, UA Global, and the support of many international research centers, including the Fulbright organization. For those who don't know me, my name is Beth Weinstein, and I'm an associate professor, and I chair the events committee for the School of Architecture. And the committee also includes my colleagues Oscar Lopez, Bob Perkins, and Eric Weber, and students Alfredo Quesada and Hallie Letzinger. We respectfully acknowledge that the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of indigenous peoples, and today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and indigenous communities. And on behalf of the CAPLA community, I pay my respects to these communities and their elders, past, present, and emerging. We're very pleased to gather creative and critical thinkers and makers of built environments from both right here, as well as places very far away, to share their ideas, their work, and their research with our students, faculty, staff, alumni, and other friends. I want to share information about a few upcoming events. First, and maybe most importantly, following this lecture, I invite all of you to the Sant Gallery next door for the opening reception of the exhibition on Vann Molywann's work, the first to occur outside the Asia-Pacific region and the very first to appear in the United States. Please also make note of two upcoming lectures. On April 1st, Monica Ramirez Andreotta will speak on cultivating science, justice, and action through participatory research methods. And on April 6th, Sigrid Adriansen of Princeton University will talk about extraordinary mechanics and structural innovation in architecture. You can find out more about these upcoming events, their speakers, and whether they are online or in person on our website, capla.arizona.edu, under the News and Events menu. So I would now like to invite Dr. Hilary Vance, Assistant Vice President of South and Southeast Asian Affairs for Arizona Global, to the podium to introduce our speaker this evening.
Thank you so much. So welcome to our valued guests, faculty, staff, and students, and to our Cambodian colleagues joining us, Jumrip Sur. It is my pleasure to introduce my former colleague in Cambodia, Associate Professor and visiting Fulbright Scholar, Dr. Štefan Tkáč. At the American University of Phnom Penh, which is UA's partner university in Cambodia, Štefan is one of the founders of the architecture program, as well as the UA dual degree in civil engineering program. He is also the current chair of the architecture department at AUPP. Štefan is a Slovak architect, urbanist, and conceptual designer with international teaching experience and practice in Europe, East Asia Pacific, and Southeast Asia. In collaboration with the Vann Molyvann Project and its umbrella association, the New Khmer Architecture, Štefan continues to promote the architectural legacy of the Sangkum within the young generation of Cambodian architects and audiences worldwide. A versatile engineering personality, Štefan has a natural curiosity in multiple disciplines that stretches from micro-urbanism through the incorporation of various forms of water within architectural design practice. These interests are some of the features that eventually brought Štefan to Cambodia. Cambodia is a country known for its intrinsic traditional architecture built in coherence with local hydrology. Cambodia's natural environment includes numerous lakes and rivers, including the vast Mekong River and the connected Tonle Sap River, which has an extremely unique reversing seasonal flow. What bonds Štefan's personality as an architect with the actual work of the former icon of the New Khmer Architecture, Mr. Vann Molyvann, is the idea of architecture's built-in coherence with the local natural conditions and the environment. I believe you will enjoy and learn much from Štefan's insight on Vann Molyvann, his life, work, and legacy. So I would like to introduce Dr. Tkáč.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hilary. Thank you very much, Beth. Thank you very much for having me over here today. Let me restart once again. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me over here today. Good day, good evening, or good night, I guess, to our colleagues that are joining us with the Zoom. It is my pleasure and the honor at the same time to give the opening lecture for the first Vann Molyvann exhibition outside the Asia-Pacific region. I do understand how big is this issue for the Cambodian colleagues, or basically the Cambodian architects, especially those, because the Vann Molyvann as an architect, as a person that is a leader of the new Khmer architecture movement, I would say, is something that, or it is actually an idea that stretches throughout the border of Cambodia. It's not only the city of Phnom Penh, where most of the foreigners actually coming inside and they kind of see those buildings. And at the same time, they are kind of referring to those buildings as these are the buildings that Vann Molyvann built. He actually built a lot of other buildings around the provinces. So this is more a nationwide phenomena rather than some kind of local architect, just like I would consider giving an example of a Chicago School of Architects or Oscar Niemeyer, Brasilia. This is a little bit larger, and during the 60s, where these buildings were actually built, they were exposed to another world, right? So there were other people that were coming to see those buildings. We are talking about guys from Singapore, the other ASEAN countries, Japan. We have people from America that actually came to see those buildings. So they were exposed to their culture. They saw those buildings, despite the fact that they were brutalist buildings, right? And that's another thing that I'm going to be talking about in a few seconds. It was an iconic time for Cambodia, where basically this was the way how the modern, how the Cambodian culture throughout the modern movement or throughout the modern architecture was simply exposed to the world. And in many countries, especially in the ASEAN region, they were kind of, I'm not saying copying it, but they were inspired by this thing. So that's how much this means for especially the Cambodian architects, not only the Cambodian people. And another thing that is quite important to mention is the Sankum and Sankum Rinium, which is, most of the historians says that that's actually the political period, because it was actually a political period of the King Norodom Sihanouk, or basically the Prince Norodom Sihanouk at that time, who set up this political party. But in fact, it was more a cultural movement, because most of the cultural activities, including the architecture, was kind of supported exactly in that particular period of time. So now I understand we do have various groups of audience, stretching from practicing professionals, the architects, civil engineers. We have structural engineers as well, as I guess. And there are people from academia, professors, lecturers, and of course the students. Right? So most importantly, we do have people, I believe they are online with us, the people that actually interviewed Vann Molyvann, and they actually get the chance to meet him. I was actually not that lucky, because unfortunately Mr. Vann Molyvann passed away in 2017, and I came to Cambodia in 2018, so you see we almost missed each other. And my first contact with him was through Christopher Rompier's movie, The Man Who Built Cambodia, which is the movie that we're going to be running during the exhibition. I will use some of parts or shots from this particular movie to kind of create the emotional link between Vann Molyvann and yourself, right? So as I mentioned, the topic of Vann Molyvann is fairly broad, and it stretches beyond the Cambodia. And again, I tried to kind of structure this presentation in a way where I was kind of accommodate all the groups, right? Well, including also the technical geeks, just like myself. So I hope you're going to enjoy it, and yep, welcome on the presentation. So many times when my students are kind of asking me which area of architecture Vann Molyvann kind of belongs to, or you know, what is his kind of scope of work, or where to put him in a history and theory of architecture, almost the immediate answer would be a brutalist architecture, the brutalism, right? It's a part of modernism. But it would be kind of selfish to say that that's exactly the period, even though that most of his buildings are in fact placed in that kind of period for most of the historians that I know personally. Vann Molyvann started like most of us. I mean, most of the architects, they kind of went through this vigorous training through the proportion studies of a classic architecture, starting with the, I'm guessing, Vitruvius and the 10 books of architecture, 10 books on architecture. It's a really common treatise. Or, I know, Bannister Fletcher's History of Architecture. Those are the topics that he probably studied, and he was exposed to those I would say, Western cultures outside his home country or hometown, because what he did was he basically studied outside the Cambodia. So he actually came back and rebuilt the country, which is a really important thing to point out, because he was, and I am experienced that thing in most of the times when I'm teaching, he was kind of taken away from one culture and put into another culture, forced to actually learn basics of architecture that are actually based on the local culture. So him actually studying things like Ionic or Doric or Corinthian columns was something he couldn't really understand at the really beginning, and that's the reason why he actually repeated the first year of architecture when he was studying in Paris, because it was simply something that was different from what he was experiencing back home. But we will see some of the quotes from him when he's kind of referring to these particular issues in his life. And while a young Moly, as most of the people called him, or friends actually called him, was studying, he joined the studio of one of the prestigious architects in France, and they introduced him to a Renaissance. Now, this is something that I want to elaborate on a little bit. It is not the Renaissance as we probably usually refer to it, in the mean of humanities and basically centering the human being in the process of creating the architecture around it. It is more like respecting the past, understanding the past on an architectural level, urban level, and material level. And then basically grasping this cultural heritage and using it for creating something totally new. In that way, he kind of perceived the Renaissance in those studios. We will actually talk about this thing. He was working in the studios of Louis Arech, who was one of the leading architects of that time. Naturally, while he was in Paris, he was studying between the 50s, 50, 55, 56. So what happened was he was exposed to a modernist architecture, and especially Le Corbusier, which I'm guessing everybody knows. But what is really important is that we need to understand that that was a young architect, a young student of architecture actually, trying to kind of understand how to design a building that will look beautiful, and how to actually set some sort of module for that beauty of the building. And he found that thing in 5 Pillars of Architecture that Corbusier actually published. And I'm guessing, especially the students, they probably know it and they're familiar with that thing. Especially the first pillar that is referring to pilotis or piles or stilts, right? And this was the moment where he found the connection between the modern architecture and the way he would actually express the Khmer or Khmer traditions, right? And that's exactly what he was trying to do. He was looking for, and he actually said that thing many times in his interviews. He was looking for the origins of the Cambodian people, right? And he tries to do it through his profession, right? Through the architecture. And 5 Pillars of Architecture was one of the way how he could actually achieve this thing. The same thing would be le modular, right, or the modular, which is, I know these days it sounds kind of obsolete to actually use a modular, right? We are using another typological forms to do that, but that time it was state of the art and never been done before, although there were some other attempts to do that. but he created the modular, and Vann Molyvann actually took it from him, and he tried to adapt it to a Cambodian scale, and he used it to design his buildings. So for a young architect trying to look for some sort of way how to, let me put it in the terms of mathematically define the beauty of architecture, these were his tools, right? The modular, the 5 pillars of architecture. He got the vocabulary, and he got the mathematical solution for that. So, as I said, this was his sort of endeavor to define and calculate the beauty in architecture. So later in his practice, he was kind of exposed to Japanese culture. That was somewhere in the middle of his practice, and this is really interesting because he kind of focused on Japanese traditional architecture, of course. I mean, that's something you cannot really omit while you're in Japan, the imperial architecture. But what he mentioned many times is that he was kind of he kind of liked the fact that they were using a different type of a module, and that module was a tatami module, which those of you who are kind of studying Japanese architecture, at least remotely, you cannot really kind of omit that thing. It's the part of the architecture in Japan that kind of works all around. Just like in Chinese architecture, you would refer to pinks rather than square meters, right? So this is exactly the same thing that happens in Japan. Now, the last but not least, if we are defining the Vann Molywann's entire work, we would probably use the term tropical regionalism, right, which is the third from the bottom. Now, this is a term that was coined somewhere in the 50s. He started to design his buildings in 1955, 1956. He graduated at the beginning of 60s until the end of 60s. So the last building that actually was at the previous slide was somewhere in 1972. So you see that actually his career stretches throughout, give or take, 13 years only. Right? So that kind of gives you the idea how long it takes him to build most of these, I would say, iconic buildings. When I'm saying that he was building most of those buildings, you also need to take into account the fact that he was not the only one working on those buildings, especially the Olympic Stadium that is actually the one behind him. That's a building that is built on a 300,000 square meters, so that was virtually impossible for one person to deal with that. But he was the conceptual designer behind that thing, and he was the one who was actually dealing with the rest of the processes. But there were Japanese architects working on it, right? There were French architects working on it, former Russian architects, the architects from the USSR. So there was a help from other people, and it is my job to actually recognize these people as well. So many times where I hear some of those speakers basically saying that Vann Molyvann actually did most of those buildings, it always kind of occurred that he was too young to actually go through all of these processes alone. And yes, he did most of his buildings alone, right? He designed them, but then we actually have the help from the other nations, or basically another architects that were still over there, either because of the post-colonial period, or they kind of came in because of the United Nations as a consultants, right? Or then we have the Japanese that were kind of helping with the constructions, because let's face it, after the colonial period, there were very little constructional companies that were actually able to deliver these kind of complicated buildings, right? So let me move, without ado, to one of these shots from Christopher Ronte's movie, and it's kind of like a small opening. It's gonna take only kind of like 60 seconds, but I'll kind of let you see probably most of his iconic building, most of the iconic buildings, starting with the Chaktomuk conference hall, then the teacher training college, which is the building that you saw at the beginning, and the Olympic Stadium, of course. So enjoy that. 60 seconds. It was kind of a glimpse of all his, probably the most iconic buildings. All of them are built in Phnom Penh. So if you're ever going to get the chance to get there, and they are still standing, then you can actually see them and kind of walk through them. They are still a usable building. They are built to their maximum potential at this point. So again, what I want to do is I want to kind of run through his life and then kind of put these kind of videos through it to give his, to kind of give you the ideal reactions that he did when some particular moment hit his life. So when we are talking about his origin, we can say that he was born in a really modest and I would say a humble conditions in one of these elevated wooden houses in Riem in Kampot, which is southwest, if I'm not mistaken, southwest Cambodia, or southwest province of Cambodia. And the building that you see over here on a picture, that's the building from Siem Reap, which is the northern part of Cambodia. But the reason why I'm showing you this thing is because these buildings are very specific for Cambodia. There is a quite extended typological research, I would say, throughout the entire provinces and in individual villages. And these buildings are actually changing according to the region, according to the province, and according to the village. And we see several architects trying to actually do this kind of research, even Vann Molyvann himself, actually. Although there were, again, Japanese architects that were working under him, they actually did research on a single village, and they found out that there are several dozens of different buildings of this type. I know they look really simple and really easy, right? But they reflect exactly what the vernacularism is about. Right? In Cambodia, those of you who don't know, the floods are quite regular, and therefore, building a building elevated is quite logical, right? And as Vann Molyvann said in some of his interviews, this occurred in Cambodian culture since the prehistoric times. So this is not something that they come up with when you see these pictures from 1919 or 1926. They've been doing that thing since the very beginning of the nation. This is important to kind of understand. Now, what I really like to point out is that he was born in one of these buildings. So he was born in a village. And lots of other Cambodians that were born in that way. So most of the time the students are asking me, like, how did he get into Paris, right? From literally, I'm going to be using this kind of metaphoric way, from like a wooden chalet. How that happened, right? So I'm going to give you my kind of insight. So feel free to disagree, or feel free to kind of use your own fantasy how that can happen. But the way I understand is that he got a father from a village, but his mother was from Phnom Penh. Right? Now we need to understand the kind of historical context over here. His mother was from Phnom Penh. He was living in a village, but she was definitely exposed to a colonial period time, right? That happened in Phnom Penh, because that was the time when most of these foreigners and the foreign Western cultures actually happened. Right? So she was born over there, she was raised over there, and then she went to actually living in a village and rise up on Molyvann, right? So the way I'm usually kind of presenting this thing to my students, and again, this is solemnly my own opinion, it's not based on any facts, is that a father actually gave him most of these traditional approaches if it comes to culture. They are based, as Vann Molyvann says many times, on a myth, right? Whereas the mother was kind of encouraging him to get some solid background, some science behind that thing, because she knew that that actually exists already. She was exposed to something like that. And many times the people are kind of rising and says, like, how do you know that? I mean, this anybody can say that thing. Well, the fact is that at the end, he was the one who went to Phnom Penh and studying in the only high school, he says Sisavat, and we're talking about the only high school in the entire country. So you can imagine how hard it was probably to get there, right? So you kind of need some sort of dedication to get to this kind of position, especially coming from a province like this. So again, it is my own opinion, and feel free to disagree, but that would be my way of understanding why he actually why he was actually looking for some tangible tangible background for his for the culture, right? And as he says again, he was looking for the origins of the Cambodian people. Right? So he had to actually run through the origin of the Khmer people and the origin of the culture. And in one of his very old interviews, he actually says that that actually had to be some sort of, I would say, a scientific way how to kind of understand what's happening on the outside. And I guess he was looking for that kind of thing for pretty much the rest of his life. So when he finished his baccalaureate degree in 1944, and then he studied for 1 year law in Royal School of Administration in Phnom Penh. Here is another thing that kind of makes me think that he was actually dedicated to science and research and getting some kind of tangible background behind his knowledge. Because what happened is that after he finished his first year of law in Cambodia, he get the scholarship. It's a royal scholarship. Not everybody can get it. And as far as I know, based on my research, there were only 2 of those scholarships. He was one of them getting it. And he went to study to Paris, or basically to France, which was, in my opinion, quite prominent way how to actually get that education. Now, obviously, that was the only way how to get it, through knowledge, right? So he had to be pretty talented to actually get that kind of opportunity. Now, we know the rest. As I mentioned, he kind of get to Paris. He started to study originally at the Sorbonne law, but then he switched it to École des Beaux-Arts, or the School of Fine Art, National School of Fine Art, and studying architecture. And again, people are usually asking, why would he do this kind of switch? Because, I mean, as far as they understand, the law is pretty prominent. So what happened is, again, I'll go to the way he was trying to get this kind of solid background research on the origin of the Cambodian people. You can't really do that in a law, and you can't really do it in a foreign country, in a law. So that's what probably kind of forced him to switch to architecture, because he could perfectly do it over there, right, as a manner of combining the culture and the architecture. So what he did, he started to study the architecture at the École des Beaux-Arts, and this is where he gets into a studio of Louis Arech, one of the architects that was kind of leading the School of Architecture, I would say, and most of the French architects that kind of came after that were kind of trained by Louis Arech. And we're going to have a slide about him, but I want to kind of go back to the moment where he was kind of forced to respect the Western culture. And he got a really nice quote over there, and I would like to share it with you. So what he says was that, I was a Buddhist jumping in a Western architecture, and coming from a Cambodia and being forced to draw a Corinthian, Doric, and Ionic columns was not easy, but it served me well at the end. Now, I would like to stop over here for a second and recognize one thing. As Hillary and Beth pointed out, I am not teaching only in the US. I'm not teaching in Cambodia only, but I have been teaching in Taiwan. And of course, in Slovakia, I had to teach in Slovak language, but I had the chance to teach guys from the Middle East. So I had that kind of experience when I have students coming from a different cultural background, and I have to teach them these technical things, right? So you need to start somewhere, and most of the professors that I'm teaching with, they kind of enforce the Western architecture, which probably happened over here as well for him. So I totally understand the kind of, I would say, the frustration that happened at the very beginning, the first year that he got. But then he kind of understands that this is something that he must do if you want to kind of pursue the architecture. And usually I'm kind of referring to a different architectural background when I'm teaching these things to especially foreign students. So just like he got his Buddhist cultural background, I have students that are coming from China, right? So they're usually using not the Vitruvius, 10 books about the architecture, not the Bannister Fletcher's book, but they are using Yin Zhao Fash, which is something similar, right? And kind of compromise the architecture of the historical architecture, the basics of the Chinese architecture. Then we have the Indian architecture. They have actually their own. I forget actually the name of the sastra something, but what happens is that they have their own, let's say, 10 books of architecture. And if you are teaching these kind of students, you should actually know this global context. I'm not saying that you need to force, right, this context automatically, but you need to kind of recognize it. Right? And that's what didn't happen that time, because he was a foreign student coming into a foreign country, and he was kind of like forced to do something totally different. So for most of the foreign students, they are maybe over here with us, right? It's absolutely normal for you. But that time it was a problem, right? Not every teacher kind of understood that thing, right? Because they've been trained by their teacher and they've been trained by their teachers. Right? So this quote, I like it because it sounds really funny, and I mean these days, and it literally reflects something that most of my foreign students, they don't even think about it, because I'm usually teaching and recognizing those things, but I understand that that actually happens, and many of them don't realize it. They just kind of go with the flow and fighting with something that they should not be fighting with. So while he was studying at the École des Beaux-Arts, he understood that there is a traditional approach, a classic approach to the architecture, and then there is this modernist, experimental, almost scientific way how to build a building, right? How to approach the design plans. And both of them could be understood through a ratio, or the rational support, or just built through the pure intuition. Right? And he got these two kind of streams over there. He understood them, and obviously I'm paraphrasing the book that I have read about Vann Molyvann. There's a book from Helen Van Ross and Daryl M. Collins. I'm pretty sure that they are both online with us. It's a fantastic book, which is called the Building Cambodia, 1953, and I think it's in 1972, that's how they dated it. And it's literally about the new Khmer architecture. And what happens is, like, they literally, based on the interviews, find out that Vann Molyvann was literally referring to these streams. He recognized them as a student. Right? And this is really important, because most of the students at that time, they were just going with the flow. Right? And he recognized that there are two flows, and he can either go with the traditional architecture, repeat the traditional architecture, and ending up with probably doing something like his colleague back in the colonial time. And he would never do what he did, because if he come back and he would be just kind of repeating the colonial architecture, as we're going to see in a few slides, he would never actually get to the point where he would do a modern architecture with the Khmer cultural expression. And he would never be able to do that. But then he chose the modernism, he chose the experiment, he chose that kind of scientific background, and I kind of like that kind of thinking, because when you are a student, you should definitely experiment with whatever kind of teacher throws at you. Right? And you probably, those that are your students over here, you probably know that, so this is nothing new for you. So let me jump to his mentor, right, Louis Arech. One of the most important things is that he was his professor, and at the same time he was an owner of the studio. And most of these famous architects that actually went through his hands, so you would say that he's a mother of most of the French architects. Not only French, because in his studios there were also foreigners, including Molyvann, but also some architects from here, from the US. And they were practicing, as far as I know, in late 80s. Right? So some of those buildings are actually standing over here in the US. So as I said, he was trying to find that connection. Vann Molyvann was trying to find that connection between the Khmer art and the modern architecture. He was trying to find that link. And Louis Arech kind of told him that Renaissance issue that I said at the very beginning. So what happens is that he was an architect that was respecting the path, respecting the urban planning, the original urban planning, respect the architecture, and respect the material solution. And Vann Molyvann almost immediately kind of connected with the Angkorian principles. And we're going to get to this thing in the next slide. The Angkorian principles are basically the principles that the Angkorian builders used to build the Angkor Wat. So he was trying to kind of take those things, and of course, don't rebuild the Angkor Wat somewhere else, right? But use that knowledge and or these principles, and build something modern, something new, right? So let's say using the same material, right? Using the same structure of the moats that we're going to see in a second. Right? So let me kind of jump into it. And many times when I see speakers kind of talking about Vann Molyvann, they almost always show that kind of slide or something similar. So what happens, you see the Angkor Wat, which is on your right, and then on your left you see the stadium. Right? Now there are these sections over there where the first one is actually the Angkor Wat and the second one is the stadium. And then you can see the Angkorian principles where he's respecting the moats, which are really important in Cambodia because if you don't have them, you basically got flood in your area, right? So you need some space to drain the water, right? And he respected this. Now in Angkor Wat, if you kind of understand the structure, you will see this city. It's basically a one building, one mass that is kind of surrounded by the water moat around. And what happens whenever it rains, right? It basically drains into those moats. Right? So they have architectural, of course they have some architectural, some composition principles, but they have a function that is inevitable for this architecture. And he used that kind of tradition, right? That kind of knowledge to build a stadium. He didn't get the materials somewhere from another country, which was something that he could do during the colonial period, or sorry, post-colonial period, but he didn't. He used the soil that he got at his disposal, just like the Angkorians, right? Or basically the Angkorian builders. And he built the stadium basically from the soil, right? And then, of course, there are some construction that had to be done because of the indoor stadium, but the outdoor stadium is purely using the Angkorian principles, right? So he used the soil, he used the rammed earth that he got at his disposal, and then respect the moat. So he drained the entire area, and you never had any kind of troubles with this thing. And as we kind of see when I'm going to be kind of running through his projects, I hope I'm going to have enough time to do that. These moats are being filled up by the developing companies right now, and the stadium is slowly getting flooded. Right? So this is a big issue in Cambodia because sooner or later the stadium will actually going to deteriorate and eventually fall down because it was not designed for that kind of weather load, right? Now then, I mentioned the traditional materials, right, and the materials on site, right, which is quite important, and then the respect towards the site, or Junius Lotzi, which you probably know, I mean, the standard architectural terms that we are using. Now, while in Paris, he was also exposed to these modern movements, starting with Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, and the Bauhaus, of course, Frank Lloyd Wright, Louis Kahn, and Paul Rudolph, which, I mean, he was probably his most famous, favorite person, because what he did was that he kind of combined the organic, cultural, and modern architecture into one. And there are certain quotes that I would like to share with you when they were asking him about these particular icons of a modern architecture. He kind of defined them by his own way, right? And I always kind of like it because when you're talking about Frank Lloyd Wright, you're obviously going to go ahead and say some of these specific lines that you probably gonna find in every kind of book, but he kind of used his own interpretation. And if it comes to Paul Rudolph, who he likes a lot, he basically says that he was a sculptor, right, and as a structuralist, and at the same time he was a humanist. So what you immediately see if you look at, let's say, the Yale University's library, right, which is Paul Rudolph's probably one of those first buildings, you can see that he used the structure as the form of expressing the architecture, right? And that is something that he later actually sees in his own works. And when I think it was Helen who asked him, so how would you define your own architecture? What would be like your expression? He says structure is a form of a sculpture. Now, to kind of make you understand how strong this is, he did this thing in 60s, right? Now we have people like Santiago Calatrava, probably most of you know who he is. And he's using exactly the same expression. But he's using it because the time and the technology allows him to do it. And Molyvann was fairly restricted on this point, right? But he still managed to do what he did. So that kind of make you understand the strength of the architecture that he was actually working on. So let me show you a small shot where he's kind of talking about Corbusier and the connection that he found in those 5 pillars.
Pourquoi j'ai choisi le Corbusier? Parce que le Corbusier crée ses unités d'habitation sur pilotis. Les maisons sur pilotis existaient au Cambodge déjà du temps de la préhistoire. Quand on a fait des fouilles, on trouvait toutes nos maisons étaient sur pilotis. Ça existait en germe chez le Corbusier, ce que je fais donc comme architecture archéologique. Je n'ai fait donc que adapter son vocabulaire à l'architecture khmer.
So you kind of see how he managed to do that, right? And it almost immediately kind of strikes him that using a piles, which is one of those 5 pillars, would actually help him to establish that kind of link between the Khmer culture and or tradition, I would say, the building tradition, or vernacularism, if you want to be specific, and the modern architecture, the modern expression. Right? So let me kind of finish this one up. He graduated in 1955. He got numerous prizes for his recognitions for his final diploma thesis, and then he got a registration by the French government as an architect. So he became a first Cambodian licensed architect, which is a really important issue. When he came back, he was really the only licensed architect. So when he returned back to Cambodia in 1956, the problem was that he was a licensed architect, he was trained architect, and he got a fair share of practice in France. He participated in some of those urban plannings in Louis Arech's studio. So he got this fancy education, but unfortunately in Cambodia nobody knows what he can actually do, right? So he set up the practice with one of his, I guess, a classmate, I would say, although it was a different university, but they probably know each other because the dormitory was similar. And he was an interior designer, Soteng. And he came back to Cambodia in 1955 to kind of work on the exhibition, the National Expo, that kind of opens and opens the Cambodia and celebrates the independence. And he was committed to 4 pavilions that he built over there. And Vann Molyvann kind of joined him, and they basically opened a studio together. But it didn't really last too long because, as you can imagine, they didn't really have that many commissions. Right? This was a post-colonial period, and you were either working for the government or you didn't really get that many chances to kind of work on some larger projects that would actually fill your companies. Until he got one commission that kind of brings him something that started his entire 13 years career. And I'm going to look at that thing right now.
In 1956, Vann Molyvann returns to a newly independent Cambodia.
J'étais marié déjà et j'avais 2 enfants avec moi. Donc, de ce temps-là, je n'avais pas de travail, personne ne voulait de moi. On ne savait pas ce que c'était le métier d'architecte. Est-ce que c'est un dessinateur ou bien c'est un constructeur? On ne sait pas.
After searching for work for almost a year and on the verge of giving up, Vann Molyvann is offered a small government commission to build a stupa. It's through this contract that Vann Molyvann is introduced to King Norodom Sihanouk.
The post-independence period is, many people refer to it as a golden age for Cambodia, and it indeed was. The prince, Norodom Sihanouk, was reinvigorating Cambodia. It was part of a national spirit that immediately followed independence. It was a sort of euphoria that swept the population and all creative people along.
On était dans un enthousiasme extraordinaire. Cette époque du Sankumrinayum, c'est 4 ou 5 années entre 1955 jusqu'à le coup d'État du général Ronald, c'était extraordinaire pour tout le Cambodge. Jamais on ne retrouvera une telle ambiance.
Impressed with Vann Molyvann's abilities, Sihanouk appoints him head of urban planning and commissions him to design a grand monument to memorialize Cambodia's independence.
I think the king probably saw Vann Molyvann as an answer to his prayers, because this is exactly the sort of person he needed. He didn't want repetitious colonial buildings, he wanted new architecture. And that's exactly what Vann Molyvann gave him, new Khmer architecture.
So now you understand how that link was quite important, right, between the original culture and the modern architecture. Right? He kind of combined them together, and that's how you get the, I don't want to say new Khmer architecture, because Daryl said it first, but literally first he was the one coining it. But it was exactly what the situation that Vann Molyvann found himself in requires it. Right? Now, I will kind of fastly run through the rest of the presentation, and I want to show you some of those buildings, and most of you are going to see later in our presentation hall, the exhibition. So one of them is the Chaktomuk Conference Hall, the one that you saw at the very beginning of the entire presentation. It was built in 1961, and it is what it says it is. It's a conference hall, original built for I think it was a Buddhist conference or symposium that was first time held in that building. What is nice about this building is that it is kind of opening from the water towards the city, right? And that's something that kind of referring to the fact that Cambodia or Cambodian people are many times referred to as a people of, like a water nation, right? Because there's water literally everywhere, and the successive flood and everything else related with that thing. Another thing is that this building is literally pointing towards the royal palace, which if we look at some of the details later, we'll understand that he was kind of working with that axis. Now, another thing that I kind of want to show over here is the way he was trying to cool down the building. Now, Cambodia is a country where 30 degrees Celsius, I don't know how many, it's hot. Good. Okay, so it is hot. Right. I know how many Fahrenheit. I'm sorry, trained in Europe, I don't know Fahrenheit. So what happens is that he didn't have at his disposal ACs or anything else, right? Or heat pumps or something like that we would use these days. But he got the idea to create this kind of double wall system, right? A chamber wall. These days we would use a chamber wall, but at that time he couldn't do that. So he was trying to apply a double skin facade, and the main function, the main program was kind of hidden within the building, right? And then he let kind of air to go and flow through it, especially from the breeze coming from the water. So you can see on the first floor, that's actually quite. It's pretty straightforward when you see kind of air coming from the water, from the river, and kind of entering the passages around and cooling down the inner walls. Now, remember this particular issue, because what he did later, he kind of repeated in the National Theatre that I'm going to show you in a second. Over here we can see this connection with the royal palace. He used the spiral that kind of reflects to the royal palace. And you can see that the middle part, the middle function was actually cooled also from the bottom, also from the top. This building was built in 1961, so it's actually at the very beginning where he was starting to experimenting with the piles, with the stilts. So you can see that there are still some load-bearing walls at the bottom, but later he literally elevated everything, and we will see that in one of these next buildings. This is how it looked like in 2003, and this is how it's going to look. This is how it looked like right now, according to the Google Earth. I just literally point out this thing from the Google Earth because, as we'll see in some of those buildings, they're literally disappearing, they're deteriorating. So this one is a lucky one, I would say. It was one of those first and still stands. As far as I know, there is a Malaysian company that kind of renovated partially. So this is his a little bit more modest, I would say modest topic. 100 houses, which he built as a social project for Cambodian National Bank. And he built it to accommodate the workers that were pretty much building the buildings around the airport. He literally reinvented the traditional vernacular architecture of the Khmer villages, especially the one he was born in, right? The building that he was born in. He created this module where, again, the cooling is quite important. He didn't have any ACs, anything. Even we will see in the next slides that people are putting ACs right now. They're kind of blocking all of these inlets and everything. So they're kind of, I would say, tampering with the original idea. But what he did over here, and I want to mention at least one of those features, is that he created the air cushion between the roof, the actual roof, and the construction. So this is something that is almost automatic these days. We're using it. We are creating a chamber walls. We are creating a chamber roofs. But he did that thing, again, in 1960s. And he did it on one of the very basic architecture that you can imagine. This is a modular system that was repeated 100 times. Right? Now, it is already elevated. So this is exactly where he already understood that, okay, the building needs to be elevated totally. There needs to be a programmable ground floor. And it is, even these days, you can see some of those modern adaptation. The people are kind of paving it, which is not exactly a good idea because you originally put the moats over there for rain. But it is programmable, that's the point. It is adaptable through the time. This is the original planning of the 100 houses. This is a picture from 2000, so you can see that some of these roofs are already kind of changing their shape. This is how it looked like in 2012, and this is how it looked like almost nowadays, right? You can see that there is an additional typology kind of getting into that. People are expanding it. And you can see some of those buildings are still standing, although this is from 2012. But you can see that the gable vent, which is one of the most important parts of the whole the air cushion system, is actually blocked. People are blocking it, and then they are putting the ACs over there to cool down the space, right? So the entire system, including the architecture itself, is kind of diminishing. Another thing is, of course, the Olympic Stadium. This is just incredibly large topic, which I'm pretty sure we can do one presentation only about this one, but I'll just run through it and show you the sketch, the original sketch, and then the modes, which are the most important. Let's actually kind of zoom in a picture of what you saw at the very beginning. So what happens is that he kind of drained the entire space to those modes, and those modes are later filled in. So those modes are also integrated into the indoor stadium, right? We kind of see that thing in the concrete structure, and this is the cross section of the concrete structure with the waffle slabs. Again, this had to be built in a 2 years' time, right? There was a deadline on that thing. We are talking about the building that was built in the 60s with the workers that were literally using ox to pull the roller or something before you actually put some excavator over there because the soil was so soaked, right? So it's a lots of manual work that had to be done, and we need to always kind of see this thing before we actually start to see the entire structure. And the whole cover is actually lying on the 4 pillars, right? The rest of the things is just a non-supporting structure. And they just have to be over there, the auditorium and the rest of the things. This is a detail of the drainage system and one of the pillars, right? So when you're looking at the pillar is actually hollow and is actually collecting the rainwater, right? And then kind of distributes it into those ponds around the stadium, and later expose it to the individual modes. Now let's go to the sad part. This is the original plan. This is from 2003, where you still can sort of distinguish the modes. There are the green patches over there. This is how it looked like in 2000, I think it was 10. And then the last one is from 2021, when you can see the extensive development projects. These modes are being turned into underground parking lots, totally defying the original idea. And the area of the Olympic Stadium is actually being flooded on a regular basis, which again, this is a reinforced concrete or precast concrete sometimes. So you can see rebars, they're already kind of exposed, and it's just a matter of time when there is actually something that's going to happen to those buildings. Very unfortunate building, the theater. Again, as the Olympic Stadium was perceived as a center for sport activities, this one was perceived as a center for culture, right? And Cambodian ballet dancing, right? Which is very specific. Again, when you kind of recall the picture from the Chaktomuk conference hall, you look at this kind of structure, which is triangular, and it was also kind of leaning towards the Basak River, right? Just like the previous building. And he added actually the pool that was actually cooling the entire system through the atrium. And you can see that the main typology, the main function is in the middle. And again, perfectly cooled by the air coming from the atrium and through a claustro wall, which I will show you in a second. Again, also in a section, this thing is kind of easily seen. This is the claustro wall that he was using. He kind of liked to use these kind of systems throughout his entire career, and we'll see it in a couple of other buildings. As a matter of fact, even nowadays, when you're kind of traveling through Cambodia, you will see these claustro walls. People are actually, I don't know whether unconsciously or consciously, they are kind of repeating those claustro walls. These days, you would probably use some parametric design or parametric architecture that would kind of help you to specify the exact size of those things. He was using a simple tiles, right? So this is something that is a ceramics actually, perfectly repelling the water during the rain season, but cooling down the building at the same time, the Bernoulli principles. This is how the building looked like after the fire, 2003, and then 2005. You can see that there's an extensive development going on, and then just one day the building just disappeared, and that's how it looked like right now. There's this kind of fast-paced development, low-rise buildings that literally buried the building. If you're taking a tuk-tuk or something or riding a motorcycle, you probably don't even know that there was a theater before. Now, last but not least, Beth's favorite project, the IFL, or Institute of Foreign Languages, and former teacher training college. That's the building that, unfortunately, Vann Molyvann never saw how it opens, right? Because he fled the country in 1971 because of fearing for his life and for the family. So again, I will briefly run through the building. We have the French language building, which is probably the most iconic one. It literally looks like some sort of animal that kind of jumps from the entire architecture. It is also the building where you can literally see the very top or peak of the way how he was actually connecting the Cambodian culture with the modernist architecture. You see that he's tampering actually with the individual structures. He's not only playing with the volume itself, right? You can see the claustra walls again, and then the library, which is built according to the palm hat. Right? So the structure is kind of designed of that way. And then the administrative building, the English language building, building A. I would like to stress this one from the structural point of view and also from the architectural point of view, the central staircase. It's a single joist central staircase that is built in a way where it kind of have this kind of V-shape cantilever, and then the middle is basically hanging in the middle of the entire structure. And this is really, I would use the word ballsy that time, and it is still standing, it's still working, and as far as I know, there's a very little maintenance that's been done to actually deal with that. Another thing is the eccentric slab that is working over there, so it's perfectly balanced. You can see the staircase that is coming from the left, and it's perfectly balanced from the staircase that is coming from the right. All done by a single joist in the middle. He's been actually using this thing even in his less important projects, and a little bit modest one. For example, the 100 house is also using the same structure, just, of course, a little bit smaller. Right? This is the way the building was built. It was quite fast because they used the prefab construction. Again, this is at the very end of his career. This is the time when the contractors were actually working pretty well in Cambodia. So he could actually get his hands on prefabricated constructions, very little things that were actually precasted. And we can also see the drainage system that was kind of in a circular way and collecting the water into the moats on the bottom, the lakes on the bottom. And probably the nicest part are these prefabricated joists or prefabricated beams that kind of works as a double or chamber wall, or chamber roof, right, where you basically kind of ventilating the roof, and therefore the structure on the bottom is getting cooled naturally. Right? So again, these days you will see some AC units over there, but before there were no AC units planned. The library is one of my favorite because it's using the exoskeleton, right, which was really ballsy again at that time. And it has this kind of, I would say almost gargoyles, but I mean, we're using the term scupper to kind of collect the water around. So the whole building is a kind of iconic. You're kind of getting through some sort of a bridge to the library that is kind of elevated, or can kind of feel that it's kind of floating on the entire pond, flowing the knowledge, right? How you rise it. So there is actually quite a nice connection on that one. And then we have the French language, which is a building B, and you can see that he used a lot of those prefabricated constructions. You can see the claustra wall is over in the middle, and then the model section from the Vann Molyvann project. Students, they actually built this according to the original plans where you can see the original stills and then the inclined still, which kind of evokes the arms of the animal kind of jumping away from the entire building. So you can see also the dynamics that he's using. So his last buildings are actually buildings that are a connection of Khmer art, the culture, right? The constructions and the expressions through the construction. And he's not really afraid to work with the dynamics anymore. Right? So I have no idea. I can only imagine what would happen if Sanko Millennium kind of extends, right? But we can probably all agree that he would probably do something more when he get the chance. This is how the building looked like before. This is how it looked like right now. So it's obviously a little bit more dense around it. And he fled to Switzerland because of the Khmer Rouge, and he became a part of the UN habitat and came back to Cambodia to rebuild it. But unfortunately, he didn't really met the expectation that he thought he's going to have, and he passed away in 2017. At the very end, what he was doing was he was kind of promoting this idea of a new Khmer architecture. He was training the new students. He was trying to kind of give them as much knowledge as he can. And I always kind of admire that thing because he was in his 80s, right? So let me kind of play you a little bit longer video where he's kind of reacting on that time when he's coming. I need to kind of cut the presentation because we have a couple of questions over there and I kind of want to answer them. So I want to have a little bit more time to do that. So I'll let the shot from the movie kind of speak for itself. It's a kind of sad story, but at the end, all of the Cambodians know it and they are proud of the person that actually Vann Molyvann was.
À son arrivée à Phnom Penh, après 13 ans d'exil, Norodom Sihanouk a été accueilli au son du nouvel...
From the moment we heard that Cambodia was actually existing and accessible, I think there was a shift there where he felt the urge to go back and provide some support, some help in rebuilding the country. That was very strong. And my interpretation of this is also that there might have been some guilt that he felt. Because he left the country, he left his, most of his relatives got killed here, while he managed to save his own family.
Vann Mollyvann's opportunity to return to Cambodia came in 1991, when he was asked to lead the restoration of Angkor Wat after decades of neglect. For the second time in his life, Vann Molyvann returned to Cambodia to help his country start again.
It was a fine beginning in 92, 93, but it didn't last. I suspect that the intention, besides the Apsara Authority, was for Vann Molyvann to take a stronger role in the reclaiming of Phnom Penh and the revitalization of the capital, civic planning that was necessary, etc., etc. But it didn't occur. He was sacked from the head of the Apsara Authority. And I think the reason was the government didn't accept him.
Yeah, you should know first that Molyvann is not a politician. He is a technician, architect, town planner. So the language of the technician are straight, not diplomatic. You have to go to diplomatic. Even if he was minister many times and so on, but he's still a technician. He's still so that's why I think he cannot He cannot talk different way. Like
After being fired from the Apsara Authority, Vann Molyvann is largely excluded from public life in Cambodia. At the same time, rapid development of Phnom Penh leaves many of Vann Molywann's most important works damaged or destroyed. In 1994, the National Theatre is gutted by an accidental fire and is eventually torn down despite promises for its renovation. In the mid-90s, the gray building is hastily renovated and left unrecognizable. In 2008, Vann Molywann's Council of Ministers building is demolished to make room for a Chinese-designed replacement. Today, the National Stadium still stands, but successive development projects on the integrated pools and green spaces surrounding it have compromised its design and largely hidden it from view.
So, for example, the stadium, I know for a fact that it means something to many people. It also represents health. It represents green space. It represents a space where people can go and walk and do their sports. So if it's being destroyed, it's not just a building, but it's actually a whole way of life that is being taken from these young people. Another example would be the theater I mentioned before. I think it was really traumatic for the artists living there, because it was not just the fall of a pile of stones, but it was really a bit of their identity being taken away from them.
When I saw the fire, all the students of the School of Fine Art, of the School of Music, of the School of Theater were there, and they cry all, because after the departure of Lon with the arrival of the Vietnamese, we are trying to renew our culture. So we are looking for all students which had been previously during the Sankum in the School of Fine Arts. We collect them, we find them, and we recreated our culture after Khmer here, in this place.
I thought it was extremely elegant. And in addition to that, it was home to all these artists and ballet dancers. And I guess when I was a kid, I was dreaming of all this. So when it got destroyed, I was very, very sad. It was really, yeah, I guess that was one of my favorite.
It's the complete visceral attack on him and his works. And the shock of seeing them destroyed in front of his eyes, sometimes literally. And I don't think any artist or architect or master craftsman of any stature who had put so much into Cambodia as he has, it's more than anyone can stand.
So I guess, I would just ask, just from an emotional standpoint, when you think about what happened to the theater and what's happening even today to the National Sports Complex, how does that make you feel? Like, feel angry or feel sad? What is your sort of emotional reaction?
Impuissant.
Can you say in English?
Without any possibility to act. À mon avis, on a laissé faire et on n'a pas voulu retrouver une certaine personnalité de la culture khmer. Et c'était dommage. Nous avions nos printemps, etc., etc. Actuellement, tout ce que je demande, c'est que toute la diaspora rentre au Cambodge. C'est ce que je demande maintenant, n'est-ce pas? Que tous les Cambodgiens qui sont à l'étranger, les étudiants comme les diaspora, s'ils peuvent revenir au Cambodge maintenant, c'est le moment ou jamais. Ne plus laisser le Cambodge aux mains des gens qui sont contre les Cambodgiens. Mais il faut que le mouvement de révolte vienne des étudiants. C'est la seule possibilité pour nous de survivre.
Une révolte intellectuelle, un peu quelque chose.
Exactement. Que tous ces étudiants-là se lèvent et disent « Nous allons recréer notre architecture nouvelle ». All these people should be together to create this movement of new architecture. No more Vann Molyvann, but the movement of this young. Yes.
So that kind of concludes my presentation. I would like to thank Daryl Collins that did the introduction about Vann Molyvann, the movie, and his daughter that was actually speaking over there. So thank you very much to all of you that are over here, and thank you very much to all of you that are online with us, and I guess we can have some question and answer. Thank you.
I don't know whether our friends online have questions for us that they want to put into the chat or the Q&A, I would say. We have one message that I'm seeing from one of our colleagues. You're probably seeing my message here. Yeah, thanks, Štefan, for such an incredible talk. Seeing all the buildings, all the tall buildings go up around the Olympic Stadium when I was in Phnom Penh in 2015 was shocking. Can you talk a little bit about the current attempts to preserve his work in the midst of such development pressure? And we'll take Lisa's question, and then if there's still time, maybe one from somebody in the room, and then we'll continue the conversation next door in the exhibition. So Lisa's question first, and then we'll move on to others.
All right. So as far as I know, thank you very much for the question. As far as I know, there is very little, I mean, if it comes to the law on a restoration and a law on preserving the monuments in Cambodia, except the Angkor Wat, the obvious one. But the law that I know is from 1996. And it literally talks only about the Angkor Wat. So that's one of the reasons why these buildings are not really taken into account as something that needs to be protected. They are actually, Helen Grant-Ross got actually a really nice way to point this one out when they were asking her about this particular issue, is that as far as I recall, she says that most of the politicians, they don't even know that those buildings are actually Khmer buildings because they simply look too modern, right? And that's actually the biggest problem over there, that we have people that on the one hand want to kind of maybe forget about this period because of what happened after that period, right? I'm talking about the Sangkum and then obviously the Khmer Rouge and the Cambodian genocide. So people kind of don't want to remember that part that led to the Khmer Rouge. And that's kind of like the obvious expression, right, when you're asking Cambodian people. But honestly, if you walk in Cambodia and you ask any of the people that you meet, random people, I'm talking about the tuk-tuk drivers or or just random people walking on the street, and I ask them like, who built the monument, the Independence Monument? They all know the name, so they recognize the person. They don't maybe recognize the architecture that much, the new Khmer architecture of that particular time. But it is getting better. We do have the Vann Molyvann Project, the Vann Molyvann Project, the Umbrella Association, the New Khmer Architecture. There are a couple of others. And they are doing a really good job to kind of let even the foreigners coming into country for the first time, they can actually join the tour. And Vann Molywann's buildings are part of those cyclo tours, so you can get on a cycle and they're just going to kind of cycle you around the most important buildings in Phnom Penh. The restoration, that's more done on, I would say, voluntary basis at this point. There is no programmatic way how to save those buildings yet. Maybe something happened during the COVID, but I'm not really sure about that. So that would be my answer. Okay, anybody else from the audience, or we can, as best as we can continue in the exhibition hall.
Okay, thanks for the presentation. I'm not an architect. I am a grad student in the field of history into biographical studies. That's why I will have a question from a biographer's perspective, since you presented his life and trajectory in a biographical methodology. I kind of wonder, even though like one of the people that they interviewed with, he said that he was not into politics, or he's a technician, he's not a politician. At the end, like he said, like he want an intellectual movement or kind of mobilization of the students for a cause. I mean, like many intellectuals existed like him, like going to Paris and London and coming back to their countries, helping with the nation building and modernizing their countries. And you repetitively mentioned that he was he was like merging, or kind of in an eclectic way, I don't know, maybe in a different way, modern and some local or traditional patterns and elements. So while he was doing that, was he did he have any kind of principles or kind of systematic methodology, these things that I will adapt from the modern architecture, and the other things, such certain things, there are my principles that I don't want to give up with them, so I don't want to, I want to just include them. So these are my no's, these are my red flags, and these are my green ones. So what was his methodology while he was choosing modern, and he was mixing modern and traditional? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I'll try to answer from the architectural point of view, because that's probably what would be the best way to actually answer this question. He obviously got some modern inputs from when he was studying in France. I mentioned those stills, right? And he kind of connect them with the stills that he got in from the vernacular architecture. I guess what you're trying to kind of ask is whether there was something that basically tells him like, okay, this is enough. This is what is not exactly what I want to do anymore, right? So it is something that I cannot really answer from certainty, because his career was literally cut, right, in 71, right, when he fled the country. So we never really know whether he would reach that moment that some of the architects are actually doing, even these days. They kind of start as students, they kind of wander around, they're trying to get as much information as they can. They choose slowly their style, maybe choose it several times, right? And then after certain years of practice, they open their own company, and they're kind of following a certain pattern, certain styles, or they are kind of answering for themselves the way they want to express the architecture. And I guess we're never going to know whether he will overdo it, right? Because he didn't get that kind of chance. And even these days, I mean, this is a really good question, because some of my students are asking me, okay, we know people like Wat Rong Nia, right? Which is, who's a Vietnamese architect, and he's probably currently the peak of this tropical regionalism, right? You probably know him if you kind of Google it. You will find him, or go for the Vietnamese pavilion at the Expo in Milan in 2015, and you will completely understand what I'm talking about. He used the bamboo construction, right? So literally the same topic that Vann Molyvann did, but a couple of decades after. I think he's kind of moving into a moment where he's overdoing this thing. And the best way would be to kind of actually show you a couple of pictures to see where he kind of maybe don't recognize it, maybe the investor was pushing his too much, right? Or he didn't, as you said, rise up the flag and says like, okay, this is what I'm not doing anymore because it's not what I believe in, right? And it's not only for him; it's pretty much for all the modern architects that I know. It's always a problem to recognizing when you are kind of slipping off the road from this thing. Right? I know that's what you were asking, right? Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Thank you very much.